The yellow Lincoln, 64, I believe, yellow Lincoln, yeah. Dad didn't buy it new, he bought it used. And he bought it because he always wanted a car that had the suicide doors, which open out. Why, I don't know. It's just one of those things. And when he bought it, I think it was Robin's Egg Blue. I think that was the original color of it. And this particular car, he put 104,000 miles on it or better himself. He just loved the car, drove it everywhere. And in general talk about cars, it's pretty plain. I mean, it's just a simple, but I mean, they're kind of rare, I guess, with the suicide doors, but to him, it was just the idea of being able to have the doors and a convertible. He loved to have a convertible. And Dad had race horses at one time. And of course the car was blue, beautiful blue, I mean the original it came in. And he decided that one day that he wanted to have it painted. You know, he wanted a different color. So he had a friend of his named Pete Peters, and Pete was a outboard motor mechanic that worked on all of Dad's boats. Dad raced boats for years. And Pete would go with Dad a lot to his different events, but he would not go with Dad across the border to Mexico. Some altercation between he and the federales or something years ago, and he said, Roy, I'll go with you as far as the border, but I'm not going into Caliente. He said, well, if you're not going to go, he says, and I want to have my car painted, you take the Lincoln and have it painted. Well, in those days, I would probably say it was probably late 60s when this happened, mid 60s to late 60s. He told Pete, he said, take my car and get it painted. Well, in those days, there was a company in California called Earl Scheib. And between Earl Scheib and Mad Munch, there was another company called Mad, who put stereos in cars. I worked for them for a while. But Earl Scheib would paint your car for $29.95. I think that was the price, you know. And he would do his own, I think he and Cal Worthington were the first ones to do their own, speaking for their own stuff, you know. And he would do these commercials. Well, Dad says, take it over to Earl Scheib and have it painted, you know. And Pete said, what do you want, a $29.95 on this Lincoln? And Dad said, no, get a little nicer job and, you know, have them do with their body work, if there's body work needed to be done. And he said, well, what color do you want it painted? And Dad said, well, what I want is a real pale gold. Just a pale gold. I think it'll really look sharp. Pete said, fine, get it done, no problem. So Dad leaves the car with Pete and goes down across the border to watch his horses race at Caliente, which is a horse race down across the border. But he comes back, and Pete drives up in the driveway with his car, and Dad just about had a fit. I mean, he said, I won't tell you all what he said, but he said, Pete, what happened to my car? He said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, I told you to take it to Earl Scheib and get it painted. He said, well, I did. And he said, well, what color did I tell you to paint it? He said, well, you told me you wanted it painted a pale gold. He said, well, I did. He said, well, that's what you got. He said, no, it isn't. It's canary yellow. And he said, well, that's fine. Maybe next time you'll hire somebody to get your car painted that isn't colorblind. Pete had no clue. He had no clue. He was relying on, you know, he probably went in and told one of the fellas who work at Earl Scheib, who probably can't see what colors anyway, painted gold, and they just painted this. So, but Dad loved the car. He loved the car, and he would drive it. He would get up on the top of the Cajon Pass, which was just outside Apple Valley, Victorville area, and it was a downhill, pretty steep downhill grade down into San Bernardino. And Dad would take this car and he'd get it to the top, and he would always say he was saving money, but I know he was just doing it to see how fast he could go. But he would kick the car out of gear, put it in neutral, and he would start down this grade. And by the time, they're heavy, they're a really heavy car. And so by the time he reached the scales, the truck scales at the near the bottom, he was going probably over 100 miles an hour, and out of gear. Now, you know what happens when you kick stuff out of gear. You lose basically most of your power steering and your brake, and he didn't care. He got caught by highway patrolman, zipped on by, and this guy pulled him over. And Dad says, well, you know, I'm going to get a ticket because I know I was going over 100 miles an hour. And the guy pulls him over and he gets out, and he walks up next to the car, and this guy was a black highway patrolman who stood about 6'6" tall. So his belt buckle and gun belt was right in the window, you know, so that's what his dad's looking into. And he said, "Can I see your driver's license?" Because that was long before they asked for your insurance. And Dad handed him the driver's license. And the guy stared at it for a little bit, and he said, "Would you step out of the car, please?" And Dad thought, well, I'm going to be arrested now. Something's wrong. So he stepped out of the car, and the highway patrolman grabbed him and put a big hug around him and just gave him the biggest hug. He said, "Roy, I have been wanting to do that since I was 5 years old." He said, "You mean you're not going to give me a ticket?" He goes, "No, are you kidding?" He said, "I'll be laughed out of the precinct if I give Roy Rogers a ticket." So he loved the car, and I mean, it was one of his favorite ones, and he just flat drove it everywhere. Wildcat Kelly, looking mighty pale, was standing by the sheriff's side. And when that sheriff said, "I'm taking you to jail," Wildcat raised his head